His was the only boat to arrive.
I think maybe it was a cow. I don't know.
There's the thank you letter from Lyndon Johnson.
There was even a monorail at one point to the east of us.
Plus, everybody forgets about pirates.
This is the coolest field trip I have ever been on.
I don't know, but I've been told, keep on dancing, won't ever get old.
Hello and welcome to the Long Island History Project, a podcast that brings you stories and interviews with people passionate about Long Island history. You can hear them all at longislandhistoryproject.org. My name is Chris Kretz. I am your host, and our opening music is courtesy of the Homegrown String Band. A quick note for today, we were playing with some new equipment, so you will hear about 3 minutes in my microphone changing. Do not be alarmed. Today we are taking a look at a very disturbing but important incident in post-World War II Long Island history, a local event that echoed across the national scene, one with implications still apparent today, and a story that consumed the interest of today's very special guest.
My name is Christopher Verga, and I am a local historian and professor of Long Island history at Suffolk Community College.
And Chris, welcome back. I didn't do the math, but I think you are our most repeat guest, so congratulations for what that's worth. But we're
Awesome.
happy to have you.
That's awesome.
We're talking about your new book from History Press, and just to set the scene, you know how they say history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. Reading this book, it feels like history is plagiarizing itself because it reads like something that could be happening today. Do you want to tell us the title, and we'll start talking about the case you wrote about?
Yeah, sure. So the title is the Ferguson Brothers Lynching on Long Island. And yes, history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes. And this is the best example of that. So it's about a police shooting in Freeport, which at the time in 1946, there was a lot of racial tensions. To dive deeper into this, the Ferguson brothers, 4 of the 5 brothers, were military veterans. Richard was in the Third Army, Patton's Third Army. You had Edward, who was in the Army. You had Charles, who was actually Army Air Corps, who we're going to discuss. And you also have Joseph, which we're going to dive into a bit as well, who was in the United States Navy. Alfonso was the only one that was not a veteran. He had underlying health issues, so he couldn't join the service. Mm-hmm. And they all served their country in a very tumultuous time during World War II. Charles, he was also a Black Airborne Division, and he also was a paratrooper. So he definitely had a very interesting position in his battalion. And he also was signing up for a second time. And in 1946, he was on furlough visiting his young family, his wife, Minnie, and his kids, before he was going to be shipped out again.
Now, were they in Freeport at the time? Or I know you mentioned Bennington Park, so let's just name a few of the other areas that come in between Roosevelt, Freeport, and Bennington.
Sure. So he was living actually in Roosevelt. Bennington Park is, okay, so Long Island, I'm sure you heard this, it's segregated today. We all know that. Well, it was very segregated back then. So Bennington Park was new immigrants, African-American community, very rich community, and it was pretty much self-sufficient when it came to, African-Americans buying only from other African-American businesses. So it was a very vibrant community, but it was mainly an African-American immigrant enclave.
And that was adjacent to Freeport, or?
It was pretty much in Freeport. It was in Freeport. I know it's kind of hard to describe now because it was leveled. Now there's a chain of stores there. So you kind of got to use your imagination, historical imagination here now. It's like big box stores today. It was literally leveled with urban renewal.
And so we're heading towards a night in February in 1946. So 4 of these brothers, 3 of them were on leave or back from fighting in World War II. From what you wrote, they hadn't seen each other in a while, so it was sort of a celebration.
Yes. It was a celebration. They hadn't seen each other in a while, and they were celebrating because Charles re-enlisted again, and he was going to be shipped off again. So they went out to get pictures in their uniforms. that night, and they went to take a bus to Hempstead. So they got pictures in their uniforms. They went to get pictures done. They went to get a couple of drinks. When you're in the military in World War II, you want to wear your military uniform. There's a lot of pride there, and a lot of locals are going to admire you for it. So I'm sure the pictures and showing off their ranks was part of the night's events. But they had a couple of drinks in Hempstead after pictures, and then they were heading back for the bus in Freeport, where they stopped at something called the Texas Ranger. The Texas Ranger is a local barbecue spot, and it's actually legendary because everyone I interviewed, they always talk about the Texas Ranger special burger. It's their own house coleslaw on a burger. So they went there to have Texas Ranger specials. And then following the Texas Ranger specials, they decided to get a cup of coffee before they got on the bus to go home. The coffee shop owner in the Terminal Tea Room, which is right there by the train station at the time, right by the bus terminal. It's adjacent to the bus terminal. It's kind of like somewhat built in. They went to get coffee, and the owner was known not really to serve black people. So he refused service to Charles and his brothers for coffee. And then Charles got very upset about this and expressed this to the manager. And the manager's like, okay, I'll give you guys cocoa. And Charles is like, I'm looking at the coffee urn. It's half full of coffee. I want coffee. It got into a dispute. And, the story varies on what went on that night in that dispute. Some people there said he went behind the counter and cursed him out, and his brothers took him out. The manager said he was trying to grab him from behind the counter. Then the manager said he threatened him with a gun to the police officer. And then the manager said that never happened. So the manager's story changes a lot that night. Pretty much the gist of it is Charles cursed him out for not serving him coffee, and words were exchanged back and forth. So when he left that night, the manager called a police officer who was on patrol to come over to report the harassment, quote unquote. Except when he reported the harassment, he said Charles had a 45. So the officer, Officer Romika, he was on patrol that night, and he took the complaint. And then when he saw Charles and his brothers walking back from Benton Park, where they used the bathroom at a bar called The Nest and tried to have a drink, but it was last call. Words were exchanged. He told him to get up against the wall. And there was another person called Herman Crummell. When Herman Crummell came along, they told him to go against the wall. Now, everything after what I just told you changes multiple times in the grand jury testimonies, state probes, the FBI reports. Everything that I'm going to say from now on is night and day difference. Everyone has a different story. So that's actually something you should take note on.
So just to set the scene again, so we've got the four brothers lined up on the wall. This bystander, Herman, was walking by. He gets roped in. So there's 5 people being accosted or arrested, I guess, at some point by this one police officer.
Yes, on a very cold February night. And this plays, and the weather plays in on this too.
And it's like one in the morning about, right? Roughly,
yes. Yeah, about estimate. So it's about 1:15, some estimates are 1:30. Once again, this part is all over the place. So the police officer said Charles told him he might have a 45. He told him to put his hands up, reach to a call box to call over. And he said that Charles went to lower his hands to his hips, and he shot Charles. And once he shot Charles, the little guy, which was his little brother, tried running out and grabbing his gun, and then he shot him in the head.
This is the police officer's testimony.
This is the police officer's narrative, yeah. And Herman Crummell had a similar narrative, but that changed multiple times when he was questioned. And also when he came back from the police station, it was noted by the attorneys during the state probe that Herman Crummell had multiple wounds and bruises. So we can infer what might have happened at the police station to have the story aligned. That being said, you had 2 people dead, except now you got Joseph, who shot as well. Police officer said the bullet, after it went through Alfonso, ricocheted and went to Joseph's shoulder. So you got 2 of the brothers dead, Joseph injured, and Richard is standing there in shock. Now I'm going to tell the other story here, and actually the story that's aligned to the autopsy records. The police officer, Verga, said he never lifted his hands above his waist. His whole arm was shooting from the waist when he pulled the trigger. But Charles had a bullet in the right clavicle that came out through the shoulder blade. So that being said, you had to shoot downward fashion based on Charles's height and the police officer's height. You had to shoot in downward fashion, or Charles had to be falling over when you shot him. So that's one discrepancy. The other discrepancy was in the autopsy records. The bullet that went through Joseph was the same bullet that went through Alfonso's head. So Alfonso, the one that allegedly jumped out to grab the gun, he was standing behind Joseph. So the bullet had to go through Joseph's shoulder, and Alfonso, behind Joseph, it went through his head. So that whole story and that narrative fails and doesn't hold any water as well. You got an autopsy record saying something different, and the brother's story is more aligned to the autopsy record. And the conclusion is that Charles, well, this is the conclusion in the book, one of the reasons why Charles was shot in a downward fashion, probably in the clavicle, which is in the neck area, in the base of the neck, was he was probably falling over. He had military issued shoes, which were the smooth soles with no grip whatsoever. And there was sand underneath his feet, which the Freeport Public Works used to put down for ice patches. So he probably was slipping and falling and when the cop shot him. This all happened in an extreme racially charged time in Freeport and in Nassau County. And when I use the title, the Ferguson Brothers Lynching, it's pretty much given voice to how the majority of the people of color felt in Freeport at this time about the shooting. Some people saw this as a police shooting, but the people of color saw this as a lynching. And it was mainly because of the history with the Freeport Police Department, Freeport Village, and what was going on at the time.
Just a cursory observation. So through all this, as you mentioned, at least Charles was in his military dress, I guess. Were the other two also? You're saying they were dressed?
Yes.
So, I mean, this confrontation happened with three people in military uniforms, which didn't seem to make a difference to the outcome, that they were veterans or still in the 40s. The war was just barely over.
Yeah, no, it's true. They were still in their military uniforms. Joseph was in his Navy uniform. Richard, I believe, was in most of his uniform. I don't know about his pants or issued shoes, but Joseph and Charles was. Joseph was still actively in the United States Navy at the time when he was shot, and Charles was still actively in the United States Army Air Corps when he was shot. So they were both shot, and they were both currently in active duty. Richard was the only one that was honorably discharged in that group.
Well, just to finish out the night then, so they were taken to the station, right? Even Joseph, who was wounded.
Yes, so Joseph was wounded and taken to the station, and they put adhesive tape on his wound and didn't take him to the hospital. And Richard was taken to the station in utmost shock. Later in that night, the Navy picked up Joseph and took him and gave him medical attention and everything. And later on, they acquitted him of all charges of misconduct that Freeport was trying to say that he was doing or a part of. They said there was no misconduct here for our sailor. So that being said, early in the morning, actually early in the morning, it's the same day, hours later, Richard is actually tried in Freeport Police Court for disorderly conduct and given 100 days in jail after watching two of his brothers die and the other one get shot. And the judge sat there and berated him, saying, you got to watch the company you keep. This is your fault about the outcome this night. And it was, looking at the trial minutes, it's actually disgusting. But, doing my recon on that judge was endorsed by the Klan decades earlier for that position to get elected. So I guess, we can't expect much when he was endorsed by the Klan when there's an African-American in front of him.
You were starting to talk about the tensions in the area, and I think that's a good chance to bring in the Klan. And so what do you want to say? I know you have some early chapters that lay this out very succinctly and nicely in the book, but what could you say about that history of Nassau County leading up to this? So like going back to the 20s.
Yeah, well, the Klan was very dominant in Long Island, Suffolk and Nassau. Freeport especially, at its peak, it was estimated to be 1 in 7 people that were Klan members on Long Island. And the records are actually in the Suffolk County Historical Society. All you got to do is ask for the Klan box, and they will give you one of these banker boxes to look through. And whatever's missing in that records, you can find in the Wagner files on Linden Boulevard in Queens Central Library in their special collections. And when you're going through this, it's going to tell you about the politicians that were involved, the bankers that were involved in the Klan, their memberships, who they endorsed. It's all the official paperwork of the Klan. You know, they didn't operate in secret either. I suppose when you have 1 in 7 people that were Klan members, you don't have to operate in secret. They were not. They were operating in the open. The chief of police, decades earlier, it was a different chief of police, but you know the culture could be there still. It's a strong possibility. He did solidarity marches with the Klan up and down Main Street in Freeport. So that just shows you where we're at right now.
Right, and they're like you say, the parades are well documented. There are pictures of people in those robes. They were part of the landscape.
Yeah, and it's disturbing to say the least.
Well, I mean, the Klan they were equal opportunity haters. They were anti-Catholic, anti-Semitic, and I think this. Correct me if this is not from your book, but I think it is. As the population on Long Island, the demographics were changing. So you had some Italian immigrants coming in. You had the Catholic diocese building up. So I guess maybe the Klan felt threatened, or those elements saw these changing demographics, which doesn't excuse anything, but it kind of. There were these tensions growing as the populations were changing.
Well, we see that today. Every time the demographics change, there's you're going to see a rise in hate groups because of the change. When something changes, you get those people that come out there that say, I want it to be the way it was, and their definition of the way it was may not be inclusive for everyone else. And essentially, that's what the Klan was. They saw all these Catholics coming here. They saw African Americans opening up businesses in Bennington Park and doing well. The Klan had their own economic thing going on, trade only with Klansmen. So they were trying to lock the African Americans, the Italians, the Jewish people out of all economic commerce in Freeport. And, essentially those groups just went out and built their own communities to go support themselves with economic commerce. And the beauty about Bennington Park was that's exactly the birth of it, essentially. It was in rebuttal to being locked out of commerce from the Klan sympathizers, Klan members, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, and so if we go back to the 40s, the two brothers are dead. Richard is sentenced, right, 100 days, I think you said. What was the initial investigation? Because you had a police involved in a shooting, so I guess was there some at least preliminary or perfunctory review of what that officer did that night?
Well, what happened was the police chief told the officer to reload his gun and go back on duty. So that's pretty much what happened. The district attorney said he was going to do an investigation and try to see if he had a case to indict. But the district attorney he didn't want to indict. Everything he said indicated he did not want to indict. And he did not come back with an indictment. And what's the term? You can indict a ham sandwich if you want to. And the interesting thing about this was the people that did witness something that might have conflicted with the narrative that they wanted, they were not allowed to testify. There was a woman who was an active member of a union. And she was on the bus with the Ferguson brothers when they were coming back. And she said they weren't belligerent. When she was in the Terminal T room, she said they weren't the aggressor. And the district attorney didn't want to use her testimony because she was in a union.
So that's Madeline Mohair. I don't know if it's Mohair or
Yes.
Mohair. Is she African American or?
No, she was Caucasian.
Because this is the one thing I can bring up to you as I was reading, but in one of a subsequent investigation where she is allowed to testify, she's talking about how she's having coffee with her daughter while the brothers were there, which kind of proves there was coffee because she was drinking, according to her testimony, she was drinking coffee at the same time the brothers were refused coffee.
Yeah, and she testified that the urn was halfway full as well. Yeah, and even the bus driver that was driving the bus for Madeline confirmed that too, because the bus driver went to get a cup of coffee doing a late shift. So,
but this is a whole nother thread in this story when you just mentioned that she was not called to testify this first time around she had union connections. And so the whole fear of unions is something I hadn't expected to show up, but it seems to be a pretty prominent aspect of this.
Yeah, they associate it with communism, but that's ridiculous because one of the biggest union shops in Long Island is Republic Aviation. And so that's like one of the biggest employers of Long Island. So anyone employed by Republic is not a good witness. What are you saying? You got the auto workers union, the machinists union. All the manufacturing outside of Grumman's, because they were in a unionized shop. All the other manufacturing were union shops, and Long Island was a manufacturing hub, commercial manufacturing hub, and everyone was unionized. This is not a union-free state here. This is not a right-to-work state. This is New York. So I think the district attorney was just trying to find excuses not to use her testimony because that's the only logic here. Are you going to say you're not using people that are in a union? Like, who else are you going to use?
So that initial probe by the DA, there's no action taken. The cop is back on the beat. How long did it take for the forces to marshal to kind of bring justice for the Fergusons?
The demands for justice happened almost instantaneously. The following days, the NAACP went right into the mayor's office. They demanded to speak to the police chief. They demanded to, get charges pressed. But when nothing came back, this is going to be the catalyst that's going to mobilize the communities, the surrounding communities, essentially. And what's interesting about this, and this is where history rhymes a lot, the community was split in half. One was supporting law and order, and one was supporting justice. That's a stark parallel to Blue Lives Matter versus Black Lives Matter. And it's almost like a broken record echoing from the past when you dived into this. Everyone started jumping on this. Celebrities started taking sides on this. Josephine Permise, very famous Broadway celebrity. Her daughter is actually very famous. She was the director and writer for the TV show Different World in the 80s, and she also wrote some Cosby shows as well. So she is Susan Falls Hill. That's her daughter's name. So she's going to be inspired by these stories from her mom while she's growing up. I had the pleasure to interview her, a very, very amazing person as well. But you're going to have like Woody Guthrie doing a protest song about this, the Ferguson Brothers shooting, which you can find online. I couldn't find recordings of him playing it. I just found the lyrics. But he did play it for the City College for NAACP fundraiser.
And I think you mentioned James Earl Jones's father, who was an actor at the time, was also involved.
Yes, and so was Paul Robeson as well. He was very active. James Earl Jones' father, Paul Robeson, they were all very active. And then the Communist Party got very active as well. Because the Communist Party, they always talking about no social caste system. So obviously this will be a great front for them to argue. You had unions that were getting involved as well. Multiple reasons why they were getting involved. You also had churches, a lot of prayer groups getting involved. So you have all these various groups getting involved, demanding justice. When I was looking at Dewey's files from the state, I looked at, I was given like 3,000 pages of this stuff.
Governor Thomas Dewey, I think?
Yes, Governor Thomas Dewey, yeah. And, interesting fact, just a side note, Thomas Dewey was the first governor to enact a civil rights law for the entire state. He was the first governor in New York to do that. So he was very progressive at the time, Thomas Dewey.
And he was a Republican governor.
Yes, he was a Republican governor, and he had his party pretty split about this too. So I'm going to say he was very moderate, pragmatic. I think that's the best way to put it. Actually, I'm going to go pragmatic. He was very pragmatic, and that's what you should be as a politician, despite your party. But he did have pushback within some of his party on his probe. His state probe, actually, not so much on the civil rights law, but the state probe. That's what I'm referring to.
So he ordered a probe of the case. He got someone to come down and look into it.
Yes, an outside agency to look into it. Not an outside agency, but kind of like a person to oversee the case to see a recommendation to press charges, et cetera, et cetera. So he's going to get a lot of pushback from Joseph Carlino, assemblyman. Go figure, the first Italian assemblyman in New York State. And he's going to be strongly against Dewey's probe into the case.
And he was Long Beach?
Long Beach, that is correct. Yes, Long Beach. And this is kind of like a slap in the face for Dewey That being said, you got to have other local officials within his party coming out and being vocal about this. And you're also going to get a lot of police officer groups, law enforcement groups. Chamber of Commerce is going to come out against these probes. And the Chamber of Commerce's arguments pretty much, we don't want to be stigmatized as a community. So they had it, yeah, so that was a little different.
Well, it was also disappointing, I think, the VFWs and the veterans associations, where did they come down on it?
They stayed neutral for the most part. They asked their members to stay neutral. But the local one in Freeport actually supported the quote-unquote law and order stance.
What's also fascinating is, and you mentioned this earlier, the Army and the Navy looked into the cases and they cleared the brothers of any wrongdoing, which I guess holds no water with a local case, right? It didn't sway any opinion, or do you think the military should have come in harder and kind of tried to sway things?
Well, the military can only do so much. They're the military. Their jurisdiction is the military's. You know, it's not martial law here. Obviously, in a perfect world, I think it would be great, but they really couldn't. You know, they can set the example like they tried to do. In Mitchell Field, they acquitted Charles of any wrongdoing. And they said that he pretty much was killed in action. They even gave him a presidential citation saying that he was killed in action for service to his country. The Navy came out and said Joseph, there was no wrongdoing on Joseph's end. And, you know, in a perfect world, that should be enough to make the local community do an about face. But that didn't happen like that. It pretty much was just brushed under the rug.
So this Dewey-led probe, was that the Greenbaum probe?
Yes.
How did that differ from the DA's investigation?
It was a recommendation to press charges and just to make everything public for the, you know, just so the public can see, you know, what went on, to make everything public, have this public hearing, and also hopefully some resolution can come out of it. And unfortunately, it probably opened up more questions than answers.
In what way?
Well, everyone's story changed. Everyone's story changed. Everyone's story changed. And then the person that performed the autopsy, the doctor that performed the autopsy, they gave him more of a platform to talk, which even questioned things more. And then they started looking at the inconsistencies of the grand jury minutes on what was said versus what was said in the state probe. So it just left more questions, but the end result was there was no prosecution of Joseph or Mika.
So the same result. There was no change.
Same result. Yeah, there was no change. But, you know, the significant thing here was this event happened the exact same time as Isaac Woodward's blinding, which became a catalyst for the civil rights movement.
Yeah, explain that case, because was it literally the same day or almost the same day?
It was almost, it was in pretty much, you know, within the same 2 weeks, let's put it that way. Very turbulent 2 weeks. Isaac Woodward was blinded so Isaac Woodward was in his military uniform, a black soldier in his military uniform coming back up to New York. And he said he had to use the bathroom. He got into an argument with the bus driver, and the police officers came on the bus. Isaac Woodward was not resistant. And to summarize it, the police officers beat him so bad he was blinded. And after he was blinded, he was put in the hospital. And no one really knew about the case for a couple of weeks until he came out of the hospital. And then this became a catalyst for the civil rights movement, the blinding of Isaac Woodward, who was in his military uniform. And once again, it highlighted the brutality of Jim Crow in the South. So you have both these events happening, police shooting and brutality in the North, and then you got the blinding of Isaac Woodward in the South. And this is really going to set the tone when Orson Welles, in July 28th, 1946, he's going to redirect the whole civil rights argument. So the whole country is looking at these two cases. And one of these cases is going to be the catalyst for the civil rights movement moving into the 50s. It's either going to be the Ferguson brothers or Isaac Woodward. So Orson Welles on his ABC radio show gave his usual commentary, and it was very popular at the time. July 28, 1946, Orson Welles gave his affidavit on Isaac Woodward, the blinding of Isaac Woodward. And that was pretty much a rallying call to focus on civil rights in the South. And a lot of civil rights struggles in the North was kind of forgotten after that.
And you print that, you know, Wells's monologue. It is a brutal monologue, talking directly to the police officer about washing the blood off his hands. And it's really, I can see how it could galvanize people in his voice, especially.
I'm not gonna lie to you. I got to listen to things objectively all the time, and with no emotions. That's what I do when I write this stuff. But when I heard the recording, I had goosebumps. It was powerful. So I could see how that might have swayed quite a few people to focus on the South as the immediate problem. But he could have said something about the Ferguson brothers, and it could have went the other way.
Yeah, so can you talk a little bit about, it is, in a sense, an overlooked or forgotten story. How did you come across it? And then talk a little bit about the sources you've mentioned in interviewing people. So I'm curious, it's not that long ago, that it's in some people's living memory. So I'm curious how close you got to the people in the story.
I got very close to some of the people in the story. The Ferguson family is still around with us. I actually got introduced to the project by the great-grandson, Carlo. Carlo is trying to get justice for his great-grandfather still to this day. He's actually trying to do a documentary, an independent documentary on this. He's actually in the works of it, not trying. Let me correct that. With documentary film producers Eric Nadler and Bob Cohn. Pretty much details the whole history and how it impacted his family years later. The tragedy, which it did. It stigmatized his family for a very long time. And, there's that whole argument about epigenetics with transgenerational trauma. Can trauma be inherited? Charles's wife, after the murder, she became an alcoholic. And, following becoming an alcoholic, she had difficulties being attentive to her kids. And those kids that she had went on to, have some of that trauma that their mom had. The mom's instability, the mom's ups and downs. And, that trauma affected their kids. So, like through alcoholism, et cetera, et cetera. So can trauma be generational? And this is a really, really good argument. And that's the purpose, that's the whole crux of his documentary that he's working on, which is an amazing argument, a very amazing argument. But, the primary argument is that he wants to restore the valor to his family by getting this closure, by having Freeport take accountability that they killed his great-grandfather and his great-granduncle. So I ran into him because I was called up to verify some of the historical background content of the documentary. And he was telling me about the case, telling me about the documentary, and I was ecstatic. And I told him, can I see some of the research? And he just handed me a big folder that was the FBI file. And I went home, I read it again, read it again, read it again. And I'm like, how come I never heard about this case? I heard only like a sound bite of it, essentially. And then the second thought was, wow, the FBI report's very sloppy. It's all over the place.
Yeah, just to fill in that gap. So that was another investigation. So while I think, was it going on at the same time as the Greenbaum, the Dewey probe, the FBI came in?
No, actually, it was secretly going on. It went on before the Greenbaum Commission secretly. The local legislators actually petitioned a congressman of that district to get the FBI investigation going. The congressman was Leonard Hall, and the FBI investigation was very sloppy. It was neither here or there on anything, focus on communist groups, and that was really it. And I'm like, wow, 2 people are murdered, and they're talking about possible people that are protesting. It might be communists. That's
right. They had a totally different agenda on their mind.
Yeah, exactly, which is kind of embarrassing for the FBI. We're looking back on it in a historical perspective. That being said, I started digging in it more and more and more, and I found the Dewey papers and the state archives. And it just consumed me. It really did. It was like it just kept playing out. There was so many more things to look into. And then to get more of that personal feel, I interviewed Wilfred, Charles's son, who actually passed. I actually dedicated the book to him. He passed over the summer, unfortunately. I really was hoping he'll be around to see the book come out, because if it wasn't for Wilfred, I would have not been able to write this book. Him sharing this very intimate story of his family was amazing. I was so happy to be part of him sharing this, because this is a very intimate story. This is a family's trauma here.
Yeah, and I say, I called it a forgotten story, which is naive because I'm sure there were people that knew it and kept it alive all these years. And do you get a sense, was it known in Freeport or at least in the neighborhood, in the community there?
That's what's crazy. It's like collective amnesia. it's it's the best way to put it. It's like, oh yeah, there was a police shooting. Can you tell me about it? I don't know much about it. It's like the consensus of it. But even the other thing with Wilfred was he opened up about the trauma completely years later. It was always an afterthought. It was something he had to come to terms with. So even the family was mainly shut out. All they know is there was a violent end to their great grandfather, but they didn't really know the details. Wilfred, when he was coming to terms with it years later, trying to find his own closure, he's the one that pretty much started saying, well, this is what happened. And, like we shut down when something that's traumatic, I guess. That's like our instinct. And maybe the community did that. It was very traumatizing for people of color in Freeport. So, and then let's talk about the aftermath of the police officer for a second, because he essentially drank himself to death. He died of rampant alcoholism, essentially. There was no justice served at all. And Wilfred did say he always used to try to mail him and his brothers things saying, join the police boys club, and he inviting them to all these events.
Yeah, I saw that detail. So, right, the police officer went on to be involved in youth athletics. And so the Ferguson family would get these letters, if not even actually see him recruiting. So it's even adding insult to injury to see this guy in your life, whether you wanted him or not. He just couldn't get away from him.
Yeah, exactly. Which is trauma, because Minnie, Charles's wife, that definitely raised her blood pressure. According to a lot of people I spoke to in the family, that definitely brought back something very horrible. But yeah, he would be sending these brochures to the house. So it was very interesting, years later, about how collectively the family was dealing with it and stuff, and how things played out in the community. Romika becomes the head of the boys club, but later on his alcoholism gets him demoted back to patrol officer. So,
well, and it's also interesting, everyone has their own level of understanding or knowledge of history, but when you think about the civil rights, you think of the 60s and maybe the 50s, but the origins, like you're showing, go back even further. So and I'm sure, we could even go in the 30s and the 20s, but just realizing that these things have a long gestation, and it's not just, they don't spring up overnight. It's all these trials and tribulations that lead up to finally the Civil Rights Act and the advances that come later, but it had to go through the Ferguson brothers and Freeport.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Is there anything we haven't talked about, or anything you want to get across, either about the book, your activities?
No, I think we covered everything. The only thing was we didn't really bring up was the day before the shooting. It was dwarfed actually by another very famous court case that happened in Franklin Square, which all communities was watching. So the Dewey Civil Rights Act was getting its first major test on segregation. Blandina Lee and her daughter and her friend, African-American ladies, they tried going into a Franklin Square restaurant, and they were told to sit at the counter and not sit in the dining room. The dining room was closed to them. And pretty much the owners was known to only serve people of color at the counter and reserve the seating in the restaurant for the white patrons. And they sat down in the restaurant and they were refused service. So they actually pressed charges under the new Dewey Civil Rights Act about segregated places. And this was actually literally a day before when the court verdict was handed down. And the court verdict was that the owner had the right to tell them to sit wherever they wanted to sit. That was their interpretation of the law. So you have this in the backdrop when Charles Ferguson got shot the next day. So it was like another blow for the communities of color right there, because, segregated places is something people don't think about. Like literally, you got overt and covert segregation, but this was clear segregation. This was like, no, people of color sit here and white people sit here, segregation. And right in the midst of this, and plus the decades earlier of the Klan activity, Charles and his brother is shot in a very, very brutal shooting, and the media picks it up and exports it throughout the country. And they export the whole narrative of Long Island and how similar it looked like to almost like a southern town.
Yeah, and that, again, I will commend your book because the documents you have in there display it in black and white, comparing it to the Scottsboro case and, the Woody Guthrie lyrics. It just, you don't think of, or maybe some people don't think of these things happening on Long Island in the 40s and even before, but it's all there. It's always been there, the documents to prove it and the people remember it. So it's not a comfortable topic, but it's one that I think people should look at, face on.
No, it is. And people have the collective amnesia, essentially, with it. And that's the unfortunate thing.
Thank you again to Christopher. We will have links in our show notes to where you can find his book, as well as links to related research. That's at longislandhistoryproject.org. As well as, I did do the math, I will put links to the 5 other episodes we've done with Chris, ranging from Cold War history on Long Island to his work with Long Island Vietnam veterans. Hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, all we ask is that you share it with a friend, post it, play it, share it, however you want. Just help us spread the word that there is a podcast out there dedicated to all aspects of Long Island history. Our outro music is Capering by the Blue Dot Sessions, used under an Attribution 4.0 international license. And that does it for this episode. As always, thank you for listening.